What's going on, guys? Ultra back here with another video. Coming back with a bit of a different style video today. The top 10 offenses in NFL history. Today, ranking my top 10 offenses to have ever played the game. This was a very tough list to make. There's been so many great offenses throughout NFL history. It was hard to just pick out 10, but I was able to do it. My criteria for this list is, as you can see, era dominance. How dominant were you within your era relative to the rest of the league at that point? Your overall statistics. This was a very statistical driven list. A lot of facts, a lot of statistics in here. Not a lot of just, how fun were they to watch necessarily, but they had to be statistically dominant and productive to, be a top 10 offense of all time and where they came in terms of their ranking. Offensive balance was certainly something I looked at. If a team was a little bit more balanced offensively, then I gave them a slight edge in terms of being on this list. How talented was this offense? How many All Pros, Hall of Famers, Pro Bowlers did they have? How was the offensive scheme? How creative were the play? How creative was the play calling? Do they have the MVP of the league? Do they have the Offensive Player of the Year? That goes for the awards. Did they break any major NFL records? And then team success was not as big of, a thing that I used because obviously team success, you need a defense as well at somewhat, but I did factor that in a little bit. So without further ado, make sure to subscribe to this channel, like this video for more. And let me get into who I believe are the 10 greatest offenses in NFL history from 10 to 1. Coming in at number 10, I have the 1994 San Francisco 49ers offense. And this offense gets nowhere near as much credit as they really deserve, I think, throughout NFL history. You look at their roster, they had future Hall of Fame quarterback Steve Young, who was truly brilliant in 1994. He was an All-Pro and a Pro Bowler. They had Ricky Watters, who I believe will make the Hall of Fame one day. He made 5 Pro Bowls as well as making it this season. They had, of course, the greatest wide receiver to ever play football in Jerry Rice, who was in his prime at this point in the mid-90s. He made first-team All-Pro this season. He was a Hall of Famer. They had several other very good contributors, such as Oates at center, who, is a Hall of Fame player, as well as Spartan. Very good offensive line that featured 2 Pro Bowlers on it. They were, of course, coached by Mike Shanahan, who was the offensive play caller for this team, the offensive coordinator of the offense. Burt Jones at tight end was very good for them, or Brent Jones, I'm sorry. So this Niners offense had the talent for sure. They were one of the greatest offenses of all time from a talents perspective. But when you look at the statistics, look at the statistics for this team. This team won 13-3 and won the Super Bowl. Steve Young won MVP. He led the league in passing touchdowns. He led the league in passer rating. Actually broke the record in a single season for passer rating. He threw for 3,969 yards, 35 touchdowns. Ran for 7 touchdowns, had a 112.8 rating, also led the league in completion percentage, led the league in touchdown percentage, led the league in yards per attempt, net yards per attempt, adjusted yards per attempt, and adjusted net yards per attempt. He was awesome this season. This was one of the greatest quarterback seasons the league has ever seen. I don't know why it doesn't get the respect it deserves in that kind of conversation, but it definitely should. You look at the offensive statistics for this team. They led the league in points. They led the league in yards per play. They led the league in first downs per game. They led the league in net yards per attempt from the passing game per game with 7.6. And in rush yards per attempt, they had 3.9, which was 7th in the league. Their league average holds up. They were above average in every single facet of the game offensively. Ricky Watters ran for 877 yards and 6 touchdowns, also caught 66 balls for 719 yards and 5 touchdowns, which is very impressive. Rice had a career high in catches at the time with 112, had 1,500 yards and 13 touchdowns. John Taylor caught 41 balls for 531 yards and 5 touchdowns. Brent Jones had 49 catches for 670 yards and 9 touchdowns. This was a very balanced offense. They could run it, they could especially throw it. You look at the playoffs, we see a lot of offenses all time kind of flame out at one point or not in the playoffs. You look at their playoff run, they faced a historically dominant Bears defense in the divisional round, or not a historically dominant defense, but a very good defense in the Bears, and they embarrassed them 44-15. You look at the NFC title game against the Cowboys. This was the team in the Cowboys that kept beating the Niners repeatedly in the playoffs. And Steve Young got the monkey off his back, man. He beat the Cowboys 38-28. And then you look in the Super Bowl, Young tossed 6 touchdowns in a 49-26 win. Won Super Bowl MVP, and this offense delivered the Niners their 5th Super Bowl title. This was an awesome offense that I don't think gets near the credit it deserves because, the Joe Montana era was so great. But Steve Young in this season was probably better than Joe Montana was in any of his seasons, in my opinion, just looking at the statistics. And this offense was better than any of those offenses, according to the statistics, which is what I value when it comes to offenses. They did not have a drop in productivity when it came to the playoffs, even while playing the best defenses. This team had basically the same statistics in the playoffs. So the Niners had the team success, had the players, had the statistics. What I think may have hurt them a little bit was, maybe they weren't as balanced quite as some of these other teams, had slightly better run games. But hey, man, the Niners, dominant offense. And the other thing that may have hurt them was, they didn't have a ton of records in this season, but this was a very consistent offense, very good offense, and I believe is worthy of being one of the 10 greatest offenses of all time at number 10. Coming in at number 9, I have the 1998 Minnesota Vikings offense. The 1998 Vikings might be the greatest team to never win a Super Bowl, bar the 2007 New England Patriots. And it's really sad that this team didn't win a Super Bowl for Vikings fans, but at least they'll always have the dominance of this offense. You look at the roster that this offense had. Randall Cunningham was first-team All-Pro and a Pro Bowler. Robert Smith was a Pro Bowl running back. Chris Carter is a Hall of Famer, was a Pro Bowler in this season. Randy Moss, we know he was pretty good. Stussy and Christie were Pro Bowlers at left tackle and center. Randall McDaniel was a Hall of Famer, an All-Pro, and a Pro Bowler. He's one of the greatest offensive linemen in NFL history. They ran a kind of West Coast offense with Dennis Green calling the plays, and they were just a stacked offense. You look at the statistics of this offense. They had the Offensive Rookie of the Year in Randy Moss. Randall Cunningham led the league in passer rating. Randy Moss led the league in receiving touchdowns. They averaged 34.8 points per game, averaged 6.2 yards per play, both led the league, averaged 21.7 first downs per game, which was second behind the 1998 Broncos, a team very close to making, or an offense very close to making this list. They led the league in pass net yards per attempt and were top 5 in rush yards per attempt. You'll see that they hold up very well against the league averages as well, with an astounding 13.5 points above league average. Randall Cunningham threw for 3,704 yards, 34 touchdowns for 106 passer rating. Led the league in touchdown percentage, net yards per attempt, and adjusted net yards per attempt. Robert Smith ran for almost 1,200 yards and 6 touchdowns. Randy Moss had 69 catches for 1,313 yards and 17 touchdowns, which was a rookie record for touchdowns. Chris Carter had 78 catches for 1,011 yards and 12 touchdowns. And this team also set the record for most points in a season, which was broken a couple years later. But that's very impressive. The 1998 Vikings ended up losing to the Atlanta Falcons in the NFC Championship on a game-winning kick. Of course, had Gary Anderson made his kick, the 98 Vikings would have gone to the Super Bowl, and who knows, maybe they would have won it. It's sad that this team didn't win a Super Bowl because they were certainly the best team in the league in 1998. But they will always have this amazing offense. And for me, it comes in right at number 9 all time. Certainly one of the more forgotten offenses because it was from a little bit ago now, but certainly one of the greatest offenses of all time. At number 8, I have another offense that I don't think gets quite the respect that they deserve in these all-time discussions. And this is weird because they were from quite recently. It is the 2016 Atlanta Falcons. And I know when you see the 2016 Falcons, you immediately think 28-3 in all aspects. And yes, the final 21 minutes of Super Bowl 51 for this team was absolutely atrocious. And as a Falcons fan, it makes me very sad. But you look at this offense, and they were one of the greatest offenses of all time. Matt Ryan won MVP. I believe he's a future Hall of Famer. Go check that video out. He won MVP. He was an All-Pro in this season. Julio Jones is also certainly a future Hall of Famer. He was an All-Pro in this season. They had Devontae Freeman, who was a 1,000-yard back in this season, as well as Alex Mack, who is one of the best centers of the century. And Kyle Shanahan was the play caller for this team. His genius, his offensive mind. They ran the West Coast system very effectively. And it was such a well-schemed offense with a great quarterback and a great receiver. You look at the statistics for this team. The Falcons had the MVP of the league in Matt Ryan. They had the Offensive Player of the Year in Matt Ryan. They had the passer rating leader with Matt Ryan. You look at the statistics, they led the league in points. They led the league in yards per play. They were second in the league in first downs per game. They led the league in pass net yards per attempt. They were top 5 in rush yards per attempt. This was certainly one of the most balanced offenses on this list. They threw the ball better than anybody in the league, and they ran the ball almost as well as everybody in the league. So they were a really dominant offense, and I don't think they quite get enough credit that they deserve. You look at against the league averages as well. I know the 2016 is kind of around the time that offenses started to really come onto the scene and dominate statistically. But even opposed to an NFL like that, the Falcons hold up very well historically. Matt Ryan threw for 4,900 yards, 38 touchdowns, had a 117.1 rating. He also led the league in touchdown percentage, adjusted yards per attempt, QBR, net yards per attempt, and adjusted yards per attempt. Matt Ryan was fantastic that season. Devontae Freeman ran for 11 touchdowns. Tevin Coleman also on the ground gave this team a little bit of a spark with 520 yards and 8 touchdowns. Julio Jones, of course, 83 catches, 1,400 yards, 6 touchdowns. Mohamed Sanu had 59 catches for 653 yards and 4 touchdowns. Taylor Gabriel had 35 catches for 579 yards and 6 touchdowns. He was a really fast player for this team, really big for them on third down and sometimes in the red zone. But you could see Kyle Shanahan get the absolute best of him in kind of a similar role to what Deebo Samuel plays for the Niners now. That was a little bit what Taylor Gabriel did for that Falcons team. Look at the playoffs, and I know the big knock on this team is Super Bowl 51, but they absolutely humiliated the Seattle Seahawks defense for scoring 36 points. They just played perfect football against the Green Bay Packers, scoring 44 points. And against the Patriots, they were up 28-3 and dominating offensively at one point in that game against the number 1 scoring defense before just kind of giving that lead up. But you look at the records, Matt Ryan and Julio Jones were the only quarterback in NFL history and receiver in NFL history to go for 500 yards and 300 yards in a single game in this season. Ryan broke the record for touchdowns to different receivers with 13 in this season. He had the highest yards per attempt in a single season of anybody to throw for 4,000 yards. And he had at least 7.9 yards per attempt in all 16 games of the season, which has never been done in NFL history. So Matt Ryan was amazing in this season. The Falcons offense was amazing in this season. Kyle Shanahan was amazing in this season. And this is certainly, I think, one of the more underrated offenses in NFL history because of how Super Bowl 51 went. And just kind of because, they were an 11-5 team in the regular season That's one of the weaker records on this list because the defense was not very good compared to some of the other teams. But, this offense was historically great and I believe deserves to be in the top 10 all time at number 8. At number 7, I have the 2004 Indianapolis Colts. The Indianapolis Colts offense in 2004 is one of the most stacked offenses that you'll actually see on this list. They had 5 players that are or will be Hall of Famers one day. Peyton Manning at quarterback, who had one of the greatest seasons in NFL history in 2004. Edgerrin James at running back. They had 2 receivers, Harrison and Wayne, who will be or are actually in the Hall of Fame, and Jeff Saturday at center. Tariq Glenn was also a Pro Bowler at left tackle. This offense was really stacked. They were a really talented offense. You look at how they performed. Peyton Manning won MVP. He won Offensive Player of the Year. He led the league in passing touchdowns, and he led the league in passer rating. Classic Peyton Manning. The statistics: 32.6 points per game led the league. 6.7 yards per attempt or yards per play led the league. They were second in first downs per game. They led the league in pass net yards per attempt and were 11th in rush yards per attempt. Hold up very well against the league average of that season. You look at the more statistics here. Peyton Manning threw for 4,500 yards, 49 touchdowns, at 121.1 passer rating. He led the league in yards per attempt, and he broke the records for touchdown percentage, adjusted yards per attempt, and adjusted net yards per attempt during that season. Edgerrin James ran for 1,500 yards and 9 touchdowns. Marvin Harrison had 86 catches for 1,113 yards and 15 touchdowns. Reggie Wayne had 77 catches for 1,200 yards and 12 touchdowns. And Brandon Stokely had 68 catches for 1,077 yards and 10 touchdowns. 3,000-yard receivers in a single season. That is certainly very impressive. The playoffs for this team, after going 12-4, were not great. They did humiliate the Denver Broncos 49-24 in the wildcard rounds, but they were mostly shut down by a very talented New England Patriots team in the 2004 divisional round, 20-3. That Patriots team, though, was one of the greatest teams of all time. There's not huge shame in losing to them. And you look at the records. Manning set the records in passing touchdowns and passer rating in a season at the time. They had the most games with 5 touchdowns and the most consecutive games with 40-plus points. The 2004 Colts were a stacked offense that had the statistics to bear that out. They were the best offense in a long line of Colts offenses that were among the best in the league with Peyton Manning. And I believe they come in at number 7 on the all-time list. The only thing that kind of hurt them was a couple of their records were broken in the following few years by another offense that you'll see on this list. And also, they weren't the most balanced on this list. They were only 11th in the league in rush yards, which is good, but compared to some of the other offenses in the list, those are a little bit more balanced, and so that's why I kind of gave those offenses a slight edge. But the 2004 Colts were certainly one of the greatest offenses of all time at number 7. At number 6, I have the 1984 Miami Dolphins offense, and this offense is really just led by number 13, Dan Marino. He is, of course, a future Hall of Famer, had one of the greatest seasons ever in 1984. They also had a Hall of Fame center in Stevenson. They had 2 All-Pro offensive linemen in Stevenson and Newman. They had, of course, the Marks brothers at receiver. They were the only team that, I couldn't really find an offensive play caller for this team, but I did find that it was Don Shula in his smash mouth kind of system, utilizing the power run game back in the 80s, which, that was something that prevented them from being a top 5 offense on this list, I think. Lack of really a great system. And the other thing is probably the lack of balance. They were only 14th in the league in rush yards per attempt with an exactly 0 above league average. So they were a league average rush game. But you look at the passing game. Marino won MVP. Marino won Offensive Player of the Year. Marino led the league in yards. Marino led the league in touchdowns. Marino led the league in rating. He threw for 5,084 yards, 48 touchdowns for a 108.9 rating. That is insane. In 1984, he led the league in completions, touchdown percentage, yards per attempt, adjusted yards per attempt, yards per game, sack percentage, net yards per attempt, and adjusted net yards per attempt. Mark Clayton led the league in receiving touchdowns with 18, also had 73 catches for 1,389 yards. The statistics for this team, they swept the league with points per game, yards per play, first downs per game, and pass net yards per attempt. The league average, they also hold up very well in those categories. Bennett had 606 rush yards and 7 touchdowns, and Nathan was actually a really, kind of creative player for this team, a good receiving back, complete back overall, 558 rush yards and a touchdown, and 61 catches for 579 yards and 2 touchdowns in the receiving game. Mark Duper, of course, 71 catches for 1,306 yards and 8 touchdowns. And Nat Moore had 43 catches for 573 yards and 6 touchdowns. In the playoffs, this team beat the Seattle Seahawks 31-10. They beat the Pittsburgh Steelers in the AFC title game 45-28. And then, of course, they ran into maybe the greatest team ever, the 1984 San Francisco 49ers, and they got their ass beat. The 1984 Niners might have been the greatest team we've seen of all time, and the Dolphins, with their weak defense, just couldn't hang with them. They lost 38-16. Marino broke the yards and touchdowns records in the season, and they had the most consecutive games with 3+ touchdowns of all time. But this team, for all of the lack of balance that I can say, the passing game may have been the greatest ever. Marino had maybe the greatest season ever. And for their statistical profile regarding their era especially, I'm going to give the 84 Dolphins the respect of a top 6 offense of all time at number 6. At number 5, I have the most recent addition to this list, and that is the 2018 Kansas City Chiefs. Of course, this was the offense led by Patrick Mahomes, who had an awesome season in this season. They also had Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce at receiver and tight end, and Eric Fisher and Mitchell Schwartz were both very good at tackle for this team as well, of course. Coached and the play caller was Andy Reid, one of the best of all time in his West Coast offense. Statistically, this offense was dominant. I mean, Mahomes won MVP. He won Offensive Player of the Year. He led the league in passing touchdowns with 50, also threw for basically 5,100 yards and a 113.8 rating. Also led the league in touchdown percentage, adjusted yards per attempt, QBR, and adjusted net yards per attempt. This Chiefs team led the league in points and yards per play and passing net yards per attempt. They were top 5 in first downs per game and rush yards per attempt. I think that's one of the more underrated parts with the Chiefs is they were a very balanced offense in 2018. People forget this because of how good that pass offense was. They could really run the ball, especially when Kareem Hunt was in the lineup. They were really a very efficient and very good run game. Kareem Hunt had 824 yards and 7 touchdowns. Tyreek Hill had 87 catches, 1,479 yards, and 12 touchdowns. Travis Kelce had 103 receptions for 1,336 yards and 10 touchdowns. Sammy Watkins had 41 receptions for 519 yards and 3 touchdowns. In the playoffs, this team had a very good playoff run as well. I mean, you look at the Colts game, they were able to win that game in the divisional round before falling 37-31 in overtime against the New England Patriots. And that Patriots defense was very good. I remember they completely shut down the Los Angeles Rams, who they played in the Super Bowl the next week, 13-3. And that was a Rams offense that was actually considered for me on this list because of how good they were throughout the regular season. The Chiefs scored 31 on them. And that was considered a down game. They went 12-4 and lost in the AFC title game. Of course, some of the records, they became the first team in NFL history to score 26 points in every game. Travis Kelce and Tyreek Hill were the first pair of teammates to each total 1,300 yards and 10-plus touchdowns in a season. Mahomes became the youngest player to throw for 5,000 yards, and he also became the youngest player to throw 50 touchdowns. So, this offense set records. They were one of the more feared and respected offenses, I think. Just you felt like this offense could score on every play. This was the peak Chiefs offense in the Mahomes era so far, I think. And they were certainly one of the greatest offenses ever. I know they were recent, but I'm not afraid to put them in the top 5 all time because I truly believe they are one of the greatest offenses of all time at number 5. At number 4, I have the 2011 New Orleans Saints offense. And I've talked about the 94 Niners or the 2016 Falcons being underrated offenses all time. This offense, I believe, is the most underrated, historically great offense in NFL history. And I think most people acknowledge it's very awesome, but I don't think people understand how historically dominant this offense for the Saints was in 2011. You look at the Saints, and an argument against the Saints offense, some people have said is, look, they weren't a stacked offense, but actually look at them. They had 3 future Hall of Famers to me. Drew Brees, obviously, Jimmy Graham, I believe, with multiple All Pro selections, will get there, and Jari Evans, same thing with him. That's 3 That's 3 Hall of Famers on this offense: a quarterback, an offensive weapon, and an offensive lineman. They had an All-Pro in Nix at the other guard spot, as well as Bushrod, who was a Pro Bowler. Colston was a very good receiver for this team, and of course, they had Sean Payton, who ran, a very, very, awesome offense with the Air Coryell system, kind of a mix of that Air Coryell system and the West Coast offense system. Kind of merging in the Don Coryell and Bill Walsh offenses together to make the 2011 Saints offense that was truly excellent. Look at the record books and look at the statistics. They had the offensive player of the year in Drew Brees. They had the passing yards and touchdowns leader in Drew Brees. By the way, Drew Brees did not win the MVP in this season because Aaron Rodgers was somehow even more dominant than Brees was, and Brees was awesome. And Brees threw for 5,476 yards and 46 touchdowns for a 110.6 rating. He led the league in completions, completion percentage, yards per game, and sack percentage. They were second in the league in points per game at 34 points per game. That was second. 6.7 yards per play, 26 first downs per game, which led the league. They were top 5 in both pass net yards per attempt and rush yards per attempt. Hold up very well against the league average. 2011 was a very inflated offensive year, but the Saints hold up well, just as well as some of these other historical offenses. Despite that, you look at Darren Sproles, he had the most all-purpose yards ever in a season when you factor in rushing, receiving, and return game. 603 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns with 86 catches for 710 yards and 7 touchdowns in the receiving game. Pierre Thomas had 562 yards and 5 touchdowns. Jimmy Graham, the tight end, was the main kind of pass target on the team. 99 catches for 1,300 yards and 11 touchdowns. Marquez Colston, eternally underrated, 80 catches for 1,143 yards and 8 touchdowns. Lance Moore had 52 catches for 627 yards and 8 touchdowns. Robert Meacham had 40 catches for 620 yards and 6 touchdowns. And Henderson had 32 catches for 503 yards and 2 touchdowns. They threw the ball to a cast of players. Brees was always very good at spreading the ball around, and 6 different guys actually had 500 yards receiving for the Saints in this season. In the playoffs, they beat the Detroit Lions 45-28 in the wild card round before barely losing to a very, very good San Francisco 49ers team and defense in the divisional round in San Francisco, 36-32, and one of the greatest games ever played. You look at the records that this team broke. They had the most yards passing in a season to that point from Drew Brees. They had the most total yards ever in a season. They had the most all-purpose yards ever in a season from Darren Sproles, as I said. And they had the most home points of all time. They averaged 41 points per game at home that season at the Superdome. This Saints offense statistically is one of the greatest ever. They dominate. They were the best offense in a season that featured several offenses that I considered for this list, including the 2011 Patriots and Packers. They had a very good playoff run as well. Drew Brees had one of the greatest seasons ever. This offense checks every box in terms of being one of the greatest offenses ever. And I don't see them in that conversation enough, but they certainly should be. So at number 4, I have the 2011 New Orleans Saints. The 2000 Rams, greatest show on turf, is the number 3 offense of all time. This was very tough. The top 3 for me was very tough. Ultimately, the reason why I don't have the Rams in the top 2 is I don't think they were quite the pass offense that the number 2 or number 1 offenses were, and that's what I ultimately value the most. But they were certainly a historically loaded offense. I took the 2000 season, but you could really take the 99 or 01 seasons, and I wouldn't be mad. I just think the 2000 season was probably their statistically best, and they still had all their players. Kurt Warner, Hall of Fame quarterback, Marshall Faulk, a Hall of Fame running back. They had 2 Hall of Fame receivers in Isaac Bruce and Torrey Holt, and a Hall of Fame left tackle in Orlando Pace. Mike Martz and his revolutionary system. He was the play caller for this team. He ran the Eric Coryell system, an advanced version of it, though. He was truly a revolutionary play caller for his time. The Kyle Shanahan, before Kyle Shanahan, probably even more impactful in terms of his impact on football. You look at the greatest show on turf, their statistics. Marshall Faulk won MVP and Offensive Player of the Year and led the league in rushing touchdowns. He ran for 1,359 yards and 18 touchdowns and led the league in yards per attempt. Also had 81 receptions for 830 yards and 8 touchdowns. Torrey Holt led the league in receiving yards with 82 catches for 1,635 yards and 6 touchdowns. They led the league in points per game and yards per play and passing net yards per attempt, finishing second in first downs per game and rush yards per attempt. They hold up very well against the league averages. Kurt Warner threw for 3,429 yards, 21 touchdowns, had a 98.3 rating, and he led the league in completion percentage, yards per attempt, yards per game, net yards per attempt, and adjusted net yards per attempt. Isaac Bruce had 87 catches for 1,471 yards and 9 touchdowns, and Azahir Akeem had 53 catches for 734 yards and 4 touchdowns. The playoffs, this team only played one game against the New Orleans Saints. They lost 31-28 in New Orleans, and they set an NFL record at the time for most yards in history of the season in 2000. So the 2000 Rams, the greatest show on turf, we know how great they were. I've explained why I don't have them in the top 2, but this offense, so talented, so statistically dominant, and especially within their era. And Marshall Faulk had one of the greatest running back seasons, I think, ever. So at number 3, the 2000 St. Louis Rams. At number 2, I have the offense that seemingly broke every single record during the season. That is the 2013 Denver Broncos, of course, led by the legendary Peyton Manning, who had an historically dominant season, maybe the greatest season we've ever seen in 2013. They also had Wes Welker, who I believe will make the Hall of Fame, along with Pro Bowlers Demaryius Thomas and Julius Thomas, and first-team All-Pro guard Louis Vasquez. The play caller was Adam Gase, but the real offensive coordinator on this team was Peyton Manning. And the statistics for this team is an absolute joke. Manning won MVP. He won Offensive Player of the Year, led the league in passing yards, led the league in passing touchdowns with 500,477 and 55, respectively. And he 115 rating, had led the league in completions, yards per game, QBR, sack percentage, and net yards per attempt. This team led the league in points, yards per play, first downs per game, and pass net yards per attempt. I will say they were not a great rush offense, but they had a couple running backs that could run the ball fairly effectively. with Moreno, who ran for 1,038 yards and 10 touchdowns. Also was a complete player, 60 catches for 548 yards and 3 touchdowns. Ball also had 559 yards and 4 touchdowns on the ground. They held up very well with an astounding 14.5 points above league average and 7 first downs above league average. Demaryius Thomas had 92 catches for 1,430 yards and 14 touchdowns. Eric Decker had 87 catches for 1,288 yards and 11 touchdowns. Julius Thomas had 65 catches for 788 yards and 12 touchdowns. And Wes Welker had 73 catches for 778 yards and 10 touchdowns. In the playoffs, this team was not quite as dominant as they were in the regular season. They beat the Chargers and Patriots 24-17 and 26-16 in the divisional round and AFC title game, respectively, after going 13-3 and getting the 1 seed. It felt like those wins weren't as close as they ended up seeming on the score, though. Like they were up 20-3 at one point against New England. It felt like they just kind of coasted at the end of that game. They probably could have scored, into the 30s. But of course, that Super Bowl against the 2013 Seahawks, which is one of the greatest teams of all time, one of the greatest defenses of all time, they just got it completely shut down, 43-8. But you look at the records that this team broke. Manning broke the passing yards and passing touchdowns records. They had the most points in a season. They had the highest points per game in a season. Those are just the major ones. But there's a ton more that I could get into here. This offense, the reason I don't have it at number 1, despite statistically being the greatest, is I just felt that the number 1 offense was a little bit more dangerous in terms of breaking off big plays. And you do also have to factor in that, the 13 Broncos played in an era that wasn't quite as much of the passing era it is today, but still was certainly, it was getting there. So I do take that into account a little bit when it comes to the statistics, but they're still, of course, extremely impressive. And you could very much argue that the 2013 Broncos had the greatest offense ever. I just think the number 1 offense was a little bit more dangerous. But at number 2, certainly no disrespect, the 2013 Denver Broncos, led by Peyton Manning, who's the only quarterback to lead 2 top 10 offenses of all time, according to me. And at number 1, who else could it be other than the 2007 New England Patriots? This New England Patriots offense for me was the greatest offense of all time. You first look at the roster. Tom Brady, the greatest quarterback of all time. Randy Moss, the second greatest receiver of all time. Wes Welker, maybe the greatest slot receiver ever. Matt Latt, Hall of Famer. Logan Mankins, a Hall of Famer. They had Dan Coppin, who was a Pro Bowl center at the time. They had Josh McDaniels, we know, a very good offensive coordinator. They were a stacked offense. They even had guys like Dante Stallworth, Ben Watson, Kevin Falk that did their role very well for them. The 2007 Patriots, of course, had the MVP in Tom Brady, the Offensive Player of the Year in Tom Brady, the Comeback Player of the Year, Randy Moss. They had the passing yards, passing touchdowns, and passer rating leader with Tom Brady, who threw for 4,850 and 117.2 respectively in those categories. Also led the league in completion percentage, touchdown percentage, yards per attempt, adjusted yards per attempt, yards per game, QBR, net yards per attempt, adjusted net yards per attempt, fourth quarter comebacks, and game-winning drives respectively. They had the receptions leader with Wes Welker and the receiving touchdowns leader with Randy Moss, who, he broke the receiving touchdowns record in this season as Brady broke the passing touchdowns record. Moss had 98 receptions for 1,493 yards and 23 touchdowns. Welker had 112 catches for 1,175 yards and 8 touchdowns. They swept the league in points per game, yards per play, first downs per game, and passing yards per attempt. Were 11th in rush yards per attempt. Did very well with league averages, an astounding 15 points above league average in scoring. That's just insane. 6 above in that first down marker, which is also insane. Lawrence Maroney had 835 rush yards and 6 touchdowns. Dante Stallworth was very underrated, 46 catches for 697 yards and 3 touchdowns. In the playoffs, they did dip a bit, just like the 2013 Broncos, going from an astounding 37 points per game to just 22, with a 31-20 win versus Jacksonville before, they really started to struggle in those final two games. 21-12 win against the Chargers before falling 17-14 to the New York Giants in Super Bowl 42, very famously. But you look at the records that they set. Brady broke the passing touchdowns record. Moss broke the receiving touchdowns record. They had the most points, first downs, and points on the road in a season, and they had the best points per drive in the season still to this day. This offense was just so dangerous with that deep strike ability of Brady to Moss that I think Denver at times lacked compared to that. They could also go underneath with guys like Kevin Falk, Dante Stallworth, Wes Welker, Benjamin Watson working in those kind of areas. They were not a great rush attack, but they were very capable. They scored a lot of rushing touchdowns that season. And Tom Brady was just on another level this season. He was on a mission. That team was on a mission. That 16-0 record, that perfect record certainly helps. To me, the 2007 Patriots are the greatest offense in NFL history.